let's begin. I give a warm welcome to all of you who are attendees as well as the panelists for the International Gilbert Conference for 2021, which is titled The Old and the New in Danger, Labor Practices and Human Rights. Session 3 that we are looking at now looks at language, literature, and creative arts. Now, all these three are in their own way identities that the Girmitians have brought or have lived or taken to the country they are residing in now. So with us here today, we have Kamala Naikar and Deep Maharaj, Vandana Vikashni Nath, Ashna Shivam and Prashnil Singh, Vanshi Varsha Kumar, Praveen Lata, Salesh Lal, Neha Singh and Sushma Pandey, and Ritu Tyagi. Now, I will request each of you to briefly introduce yourself before you present your paper. And at the end, when we have had all the presentations, then we can have a question and answer session. You will also see the chats as well as the Q&A at the bottom, which gives you a view on what are some of the questions that have been shared. And at any time you feel like you have things that you want to share screen, just raise a hand or let me know, and I will give you that opportunity to share your screen. So before we further, we actually begin now with Kamala Lakshmi Naikar and Deepak Maharaj with a presentation titled The Burden of History in Post-Colonial Literature. Thank you. And I'll give you the opportunity to share your presentation. Kamala and Deep. Kamala, you are mute. Bottom left-hand corner of your screen. I'm sorry, Kamala, we cannot hear you. Yeah, should be fine now.
Yes, thank you. The main argument in the paper is that for contemporary Indo-Fijians, the burden of history that they've inherited from indenture is the burden of interpretation. Here, I would like to say that Deep might share a few videos with you all while I am doing my presentation. This presentation is concentrated on burden of history in relation to Fiji and would be incomplete without some discussion on the history of the Indian indentured laborers in Fiji. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. After that date, Indians were recruited in various ways, usually foul, to work in the very plantations that the freed slaves had hastily left. The conditions of employment were stated on a form of agreement, Girmit in English, Hindi and Urdu in North India, and in Tamil, Telugu and Malayalam in the South. Girmit is a corrupt word for English word agreement. A labor emigrating under the agreement of Girmit was Girmitian. All Girmitians were not literate and disguised under voluntary recruitment. In reality, they were made to sign contracts, typically by affixing a thumb impression, and arrived in Fiji, crossing the dark dreaded seas, the Kalapani, to the King Sugar Colony, Fiji. They cleared the Fiji jungle, made roads and tramlines for sugar transportation. This indenture system, an inhumane system, or the labor system, or a new kind of slavery, was introduced in Fiji in 1879 by Sir Arthur Hamilton Gordon, the first governor of the colony, in line with his native policy to protect the Fijian way of life and with his bid to establish Fiji as a viable economy. He believed that imported labor would protect the native population from the damaging effects of industrial agriculture. The first cargo of 464 Indian immigrants arrived on the ship Leonidas in May 1879. The arrival of Indian labor, together with the Colonial Sugar Refinery Company in 1880, ensured the economic slavery of the colony without prejudice to the Fijian traditional hierarchical structures as perceived by Governor Gordon. Some 61,000 Girmitians arrived in Fiji between 1879 and 1916. Fiji-born descendants of Indian indentured laborers have researched to record the predicaments of their ancestors in far-flung abodes. The heart-rending records of Vijay Mishra's Rama's banishment, the diasporic imaginary and the Indian diaspora, Subramani's Indo-Fijian experience in Fiji, Vijay Naidu's The Violence of Indenture in Fiji, Ahmad Ali's Girmit, Plantation to Politics, and the indenture experience in Fiji, and Brijlal's Girmitius, The Origin of the Fiji Indians, speak volumes about the traumatic indenture system and its consequences. For the indentured laborers' life seemed to be one of hopeless degradation. The life of Girmitius was full of tension, turmoil, and uncertainty. The Girmitius survived amidst all these struggles. I wish to begin this task of interpretation, the burden of history, by asserting that there are two common tools in writing history and making fiction. These are two genres of writing that the educated Indo-Fijians have engaged in significantly to make sense of their past. First, the use of language, and secondly, constructive narratives. Another important fact is that they have used the language of the colonizer, that is the English language, to write fiction and history, not the vernacular Hindi. This is another burden for Indo-Fijians to master the English language as a second language, to depict their complex fate and to communicate that to the wider world. Where they have used Hindi or any other language, their works would have remained relatively unknown, not only to the rest of the world, but also in their own community. I shall refer to a historian and a fiction writer to examine how they've endeavored to explore their past. They are Brijlal and Subramani. They've both written extensively about indenture, or what is popularly called Girmit. The historian and the writer of fiction come to their subject through two different routes. The historian's quest is to be empirical and objective. The fiction writer, on the other hand, aspires to make his or her narrative as real as possible by using some of the techniques of the historians. For example, the documentary mode of presentation. It is interesting to observe closely how a historian works with his material. Here is Brijlal writing about the wreck of one of the indenture ships, the Syria, in 1884. I quote, At 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, 11th May 1884, the Indian immigrant ship Syria was wrecked on the Nasalai Reef. By the time the shipwrecked passengers were brought to safety, 56 immigrants and 3 Lascars, Indian seamen, had drowned. Brijlal uses a lot of documentary evidence from the archives to reconstruct this very early history of indenture. He comes to a very interesting conclusion at the end of his article, which was published by Subramani in his book, The Indo-Fijian Experience. I quote, "The subsequent story of the surviving Syria immigrants cannot be told with certainty. However, from the available records, it appears that after 2 weeks of rest from the exhaustion suffered during the ordeal, the indentured laborers and their children were taken from the nuclear depot to Suva." So how can the subsequent story of the surviving Syria immigrants be told if there is uncertainty, unquote. The historian turns to the poet Satyendranandan to invoke the memory of that experience. "Oh, my father's fathers, what forgiveness is there for me? Oh, my children's children, listen to the voices from Syria, drowning the silence of the sea." It is not surprising that historian has turned to writing fiction by experimenting with what is called faction, where fact and fiction come together. From here, Deep will continue to conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naikar. It says that I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. Okay.
I have given you. Can you try again?
You should be able to see me now, madam.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you once again, Dr. Naikar, and the whole people who are involved behind this conference. The history of indenture was from the beginning reported as a story of suffering and oppression. The writings of the only author who emerged from the indenture system, Totaram Sanadhya, portrayed the suffering and oppression of the indenture system in Fiji. The inhumaneness of Indo-Fijian indenture has attracted the most attention globally from the early years of the 20th century. The Indian indenture system as a whole came under severe criticism from missionaries, humanitarian groups, and activists in the Indian nationalist movement. Thus, activists C.F. Hughes and William Pearson caused uproar in India, as did the earlier invaluable eyewitness accounts by the ex-Girmitia Totaram Sanadhya. In his book, My 21 Years in the Fiji Islands, Sanadhya, an Indian-born political activist, Pandit and social worker, wrote about his appalling experiences as a Girmitia. The reports contributed to the abolition of Indian indenture system by Britain. The system was terminated in 1916, and in Fiji, the remaining contracts of indenture was cancelled on 1st January 1920. His accounts were used by nationalists in India to agitate the abolition of indenture system that involved Mahatma Gandhi. Ken Gillian's text, Fiji's Indian Migrants, deals with the origins and background of the indentured Indians, their recruitment, conveyance, and employment, the relation of the system in Fiji and its eventual abolition. Fiji's Indian Migrants remains one of the more enduring works of the Pacific history. Shiv Prasad's Indentured Laborers, oral history of indentured laborers, drew heavily on Gillian for contextualizing information. These were also posthumously published. The evocative "Turn Northeast" at the tombstone by Walter Gill is like Tota Sanadhya's My 21 Years in the Fiji Islands. Tinka, who spoke fluent Hindi and was interested in Indian diaspora, visited all the major places of Indian habitation and documented his research in a New System of Slavery, which published in 1974. He argued that indenture was an unmitigated disaster for those caught in its coils. Vijay Mishra says all diasporas are unhappy, but every diaspora is unhappy in its own way. Though his roots are in India for an Indian in the diaspora, he still feels as an outsider or a foreigner in his homeland. Mishra further claims that the real history of diaspora is always contaminated by social processes and, in the end, by nationalist forces that govern diasporic subjects' lives. The idea of the lost homeland is triggered by the question in whatever form it is asked, and the trauma repeats. It reinforces the imaginary and darkens consciousness of a racial collective as one sharing space with others, devoid of exclusive and dominating power. No doubt, the yoke of burden is heavy with pitiful emotions, but we should remember the good things as well. The perspective imaginative writers know the sense of freedom that many indentured Indians felt in a new country. The laughter and camaraderie they enjoyed as Jihaji Bhais, and the music and the songs that sustained them through whatever difficulties they faced. The bond between the Jahaji Bhais, the brotherhood of the crossing, was emotionally powerful and intimate as real blood kinship, which they cherished even after the abolition of the indenture system. Our culture was kept alive by our ancestors in those laborious years. This gives us a great depth of meaning to living. The writers of narratives and history have illuminated and enriched the lives of the descendants of indentured laborers throughout the world and redeemed the stigma that the indentured laborers probably felt, that they were the rejects of the Indian subcontinent. Indeed, quality of ancestry reflected strongly in subsequent generations, and the descendants of the indentured laborers have a proud record of success wherever they live now. This growing diaspora, many of whom comprise the largest ethnic groups in Gurmit countries, have over the years become a significant force in the development of their countries. They have left a mark in their settled lands, controlling big businesses, and are involved in both local and national level politics. Countries like Fiji has all had Indian descendants leading them, shaping policies and affecting their communities. This tremendous growth is a reflection of the dynamism present within the community. Historical indentured labor migration played an influential role in post-colonial literature by many post-colonial writers. The Indian diaspora was conveniently forgotten after the abolition in 1920. Their contribution to the country's economy was noted but not remembered because with it comes the remembrance of the harsh and inhumane conditions under which the Indians had toiled. Today, the Indian descendants of these indentured laborers are all Fijians. Intense pain and sorrow emerges from the stories and histories that embody universal truths concerning colonization and the Gurmit, the burden of history and the burden of interpretation. The post-colonial writers have recreated the colonial experience with a deep sense of history. This presentation has discussed exploitation of human rights that took the form of deceitful recruitment practices, poor working and living conditions, forced labor, and debt bondage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deep Maharaj, for a very interesting presentation together with Dr. Kamala Naikar. We do have a few questions, but we will have a look at this at the end of all the presentations. The next presentation that we have is by Vandana Vikashni Nath. And Vandana is going to share with us her views on the Indo-Fijian diasporic identity and representation in post-colonial Indo-Fijian literature. And I'll give the floor to Vandana. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Good afternoon to all. My name is Vandana Vikashni Nath. I'm a teaching assistant at the University of Fiji and also a PhD scholar with my research interest in gender studies, in particular women's representation in the South Pacific literature from both the male and the female author's perspective. For this conference on the old and the new indenture, I was particularly interested in how the Indo-Fijian writers had represented the Indo-Fijian diasporic identity. Hence my topic, Indo-Fijian diasporic identity and representation in post-colonial Indo-Fijian literature. For this, I reference the Indo-Fijian history, which traces to the colonial era and the indenture period in Fiji. The arrival of the Indians to Fiji on 4th March 1879 marks a very important date, not only in Fiji's history, but also in the lives of the indentured laborers and their descendants. The stories of indenture, as observed by Brij Lal in his book, Leveling Wind, Remembering, that was published in 2019, have gone through several reincarnations, where the earliest phase describes embarrassment, struggle, and toil, and the later describes celebration of freedom, insecurities, and marginalization. In Fiji, identity research and reconstruction had been described in literature, where Indo-Fijian writers delved into the history of the country to explain the diasporic experiences of the Indo-Fijian community. The authors primarily reminisce rural life in Fiji during the mid and late 20th century. The discussed authors are of Indo-Fijian descent and therefore are directly linked to the indentured history of Fiji as well as to the Indo-Fijian community. The social and cultural lives of the indentured laborers underwent massive changes during and after the indenture period, which ended in 1920, resulting in the formation of a new identity, Fiji Indians. Consequently, Fiji-born Indians, after the end of the indenture system, lost touch with the land of their ancestors. And with the new generation born and raised in Fiji, India became out of scope to their everyday lives. Brij Lal claims that once the shackles of indenture were removed, the Indians in Fiji became a growing social and economic force, and by 1945, outnumbered the indigenous Fijians. This was the beginning of the tensions between the indigenous Fijians and the Indo-Fijians in Fiji, where the latter were constantly reminded of their historical existence, raising questions on their identity and belongingness in Fiji. My research, therefore, reviews selected writings of Subramani, Brij Lal, Vijay Mishra, and Kavita Nandan to illustrate the traumas of literature, the traumas of indenture, rather, and the Indo-Fijian diasporic identity in Fiji. My findings are divided into two different subtopics. The first one is on the traumas of indenture. To understand the traumas of indenture, I referenced Edward Said's construct of Orientalism in the case of Indo-Fijian literature, which views the diaspora as the periphery connected to the center, which is the homeland India. One scholar, Harithian, from his work, criticizes the classical diaspora framework, which heavily focuses on the reasons and the conditions of the diaspora in the new home, not on how their lives were before their migration. Now, most Indo-Fijian writers, being the descendants of the indentured laborers, had used the classical diaspora framework to explore the challenges in the new homeland. The collective memory of servitude, suffering, traditions, customs, and religion unites their narratives. It is very important for us to know that all these things, servitude, suffering, traditions, customs, and religion, unites their narratives to remind the readers of the traumas of the indenture period and how their ancestors created a home away from home. The memories of the past that have brought about a sense of displacement and nostalgia to the indentured laborers and their descendants' continuous struggle for identity in the country they were born in is mainly transcribed in essays, short stories, poetry, novella, and memoirs. Subramani, the son of an indentured laborer, has emerged as one of the most prominent Indo-Fijian voices. His writings encapsulate the experiences of Indo-Fijian men, women, and children caught up in the vehement shadows of colonialism, indenture, ethnic tensions, and national identity. The Fantasy Eaters, that was published in 1988, is a collection of 9 short stories and a novella, which is predominantly set in the Indian community in Fiji. Subramani reveals the complex fate of the Indo-Fijians, whose existence in a multicultural country is challenged with the psychological effects of the traumas of the indenture system. Subramani, through the narratives in this collection, describes the life and experiences of laborers on plantation and their endless struggle to find home away from home. Gone Bush, a novella in Fantasy Eaters, somewhat mirrors the events of the physical and psychological journey of the laborers. Reading this novella not only invokes nostalgia, but also describes the struggle of our forefathers in reorienting themselves in an alien land, which later they called home. The other stories in the collection reflects the Indo-Fijian diasporic situation and how the female characters continue to bear the stigma and sufferings of indenture. In Tell Me Where the Train Goes, Chameleon Woman, and Kala represents the Indo-Fijian women who attempt to break free from the doubly colonized society. In 2017, Subramani added new short stories and reissued Fantasy Eaters into Wildflowers, which traverses the Indo-Fijian history from indenture to the 21st century. The reissue of the letter collection proves the existence and recurrences of the described issues affecting the Indo-Fijians in the present society. In addition, another remarkable contribution by Subramani had been the introduction to Indo-Fijian experience, which describes the need for Indo-Fijians to affirm their identity as Fijians, although their culture and traditions are derivatives from India. This is indeed the predicament of most Indo-Fijians in the 21st century who cannot associate themselves with India because, unlike their ancestors, they have no memories of India. Their diasporic experiences are comprehensively relatable to Subramani's introduction in the Indo-Fijian experience. Another well-known Indo-Fijian writer, Brij Lal, provides a succinct historical account in his writings. Brij Lal's writings are descriptive and reflective of the diasporic Indo-Fijian community, which is reconstituting the fragments of their ancestors' culture to establish their unique identity in Fiji. Brij Lal, during an interview that was cited in Wahid 2017, reveals that the confinements between the two major groups in Fiji, that is the indigenous Fijians and Indians, are evidenced in the non-existence of cross-cultural interactions in the socio-political arena, where the former are advantaged in certain areas of sustenance and reproduction, while the latter build upon the remnants of the indentured predecessors. Lal's reflections in Bittersweet, the Indo-Fijian experience, published in 2005, details the history and the representation of the Indo-Fijians in 5 chapters, as well as a prologue that sets an undertone to the traumas associated with indenture and the diasporic experiences of the Indo-Fijian community in Fiji. The writings reflect considerable depth of research and experience, which churns strong emotion, pride, and respect for the indentured laborers who suffered in the hope to provide a better life for their descendants. Brij Lal's writings on the indenture experiences and the diasporic situation of the Indo-Fijian communities in Fiji is priceless, as it has recorded the Indo-Fijian history as it is, unrefined and real. One need not read through each chapter in the book to cognize the experiences, as the prologue in Bittersweet, the Indo-Fijian experience, summarizes the pervasiveness of the identity crisis amongst the Indo-Fijians in Fiji. The predicaments of the Indian communities in Fiji are detailed by Lal in his distinctive voice, which discloses the troubled identity caught in a complex and prejudiced world. Furthermore, the prologue questions as well as justifies reasons Fiji should be the rightful home to the descendants of the indentured laborers. In the 21st century, Indo-Fijians migrate to settle overseas, and Lal subsequently questions the future of the Indo-Fijian community in Fiji. His essays, memoirs, fiction, and life writings are a great resource for historians and scholars alike. My second subtopic is the influence of Gurmit ideology and consciousness. Vijay Mishra, another well-known Indo-Fijian writer, discloses the perpetual struggle for identity and representation discolored through the excruciating historical experiences of indenture. Vijay Mishra attempted to provide a balance to the diasporic status of the Indo-Fijians, which offers an alternative rationalization on the diasporic subject's identity. Accordingly, Mishra, in Rama's Banishment, published in 1980, argues that the Gurmit consciousness, which developed during the period, is a misrepresentation of the reality. Mishra claims that most Indo-Fijian literature uses India or Gurmit as a center to describe the Indo-Fijian diaspora, not the other events that collectively define the Indians in Fiji. The narratives of indenture in his revised essay on Gurmit ideology, Mishra attempts to make his readers acknowledge their predecessors' agency in making their own history, despite the violence and brutality. They were able to cope up with the demands of the capitalist society. And with that, they have forged a new identity for themselves and their descendants, which is something to celebrate for. Mishra encourages the Indo-Fijians to fully participate in the social, economic, and political arenas instead of investing in the Gurmit ideologies, which bring in unhappiness and insecurities. His representation of Indo-Fijians in Fiji is promising to the new generation, who knows no other country than Fiji as their home. However, Vijay Mishra's theoretical construct of the Gurmit ideology and consciousness not only affects writers, but is embedded in the historical existence of the Indo-Fijians, which, although forgotten, are reminded by the disparity that still exists in the society. Finally, for Kavita Nandan, the expression of progress in the lives of the descendants of the laborers is connected with the topical accounts of the Indo-Fijian struggle. There is a similar following of the Gurmit ideology on one side and the progressive Western values on the other. Kavita Nandan, in most of her writings, show how the Indo-Fijian community has gone through a profound transformation from the early post-indenture days to the present. The sensibilities are still Indian, but their pragmatic and egalitarian attitudes had greatly changed in search of better lives. In Stolen Walls, that was published in 2005, memoirs, recollections, biographies, and autobiographies reflect the Indo-Fijian diasporic experiences and the ongoing legacy of the indentured laborers in Fiji. Stolen Walls is a true depiction of the lived experiences of the Indo-Fijians in the last 3 to 4 decades. The authors in this collection reflect on their childhood and youth to identify themselves as Indo-Fijians. As Fiji Indians rather. The narratives, however, develop to demonstrate the unresolved incongruity that exists between the indigenous and the Indo-Fijians. Kavita Nandan notes the insecurities amongst the Indo-Fijians due to a series of coups that discriminated against them based on their ethnicity. Nandan describes the causes of Indo-Fijian migration in her poem, Words on the Pavement, where she blames the coup that forces the Indians in Fiji to migrate to countries that lured safety, security, and opportunities. In conclusion, like other Indo-Fijian writers, Subramani, Brij Lal, Vijay Mishra, and Kavita Nandan had recorded discontentment and displacement felt by the indentured laborers and their descendants in Fiji. These authors had not only kept the historical existence of the Indo-Fijians alive, but had described their journey and struggles after the indenture in their new home. Subramani and Brij Lal had devoted considerable research on the traumas of indenture and its effect on the descendants. The Indo-Fijian identity and representation in literature not only describes the diasporic experiences of exile, nostalgia, assimilation, alienation, and hybridity, but also voices out the quest for a sense of identity and belongingness in a country which is rightfully also their own. Vijay Mishra's Gurmit ideology is also a great resource for reference, as it explains how writers refer to the indenture as a source of angst, which tends to homogenize the Indo-Fijian literature, which in turn inhibits fears of security and homelessness. Kavita Nandan interprets her experience growing up in Fiji during the ethnic tensions that led to the first coup, which affected almost all Indo-Fijians. What conspicuously stands out in the discussed Indo-Fijian literature is the displacement of the Indo-Fijians, which stemmed from indenture and continued through Lentina systems and the diasporic shifts to other countries due to the 1987 and the 2000 coups in Fiji. All in one, Indo-Fijian literature voices the discontentment and displacement felt by the indentured laborers and their descendants till today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vandana, for an excellent presentation. And we wish you all the best with your PhD. Looks like a very interesting topic itself. Our next presentation is by Ashna Shivam and Prashnil Prashish Singh. The topic for their presentation is the influence of labor migration in post-colonial literature. Ashna, are you ready to present your paper? Thank you. Yeah, all yours.
Yes, madam, thank you. Unfortunately, Prashnil will not be able to join us. I'll share my screen. Do let me know if you're able to view.
And if you can just move your camera a bit, we can just see half your face.
Okay. Now?
Okay. Okay. Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Namaskaram and good afternoon from Fiji to everyone who's listening in. The theme which I had chosen was construction of identities, and the question that I'm going to answer is how has historical labor migration played an influential role in post-colonial literature? The causes of labor migration. People migrate in search for higher incomes. This is obvious and popular. The most obvious and popular reason. It's the pull from higher wages in receiving countries. In this sense, higher levels of unemployment and poverty in source countries act as a push factor in the decision to emigrate. Also, network of friends and relatives already working in destination countries serve as sources of information and anchor communities for newcomers. In search for adventure, exploration, and curiosity, some people are interested in visiting other lands to form as a sense of adventure or for exploration. And if the emerging demand for labor may provide the required opportunity. Some might move to other countries due to conflicts and persecutions. And they might have no choice. They may simply be forced out because of armed conflict or persecution at the home environment or degradation of their homeland. For instance, I came across this information when I was reading up on Girmitius. This Girmitia, she was a lady, so she said that she was married. I mean, during those times, yes, they were married at a very young age. So when she was 12 years old, she became a widow, and her brother-in-law wanted to abuse her. Unfortunately, when she complained, no one believed her, and she was on her way to commit suicide when she met this agent who moved her to Calcutta, and from there she came to Fiji. So people fleeing from conflict, persecution from their families, they also migrate. Post-colonial literature. So there are various reflections of post-colonial literature in terms of theories, conceptions. The post-colonial theorists examine both the colonial text and literature written after colonialism. These theorists connected post-colonial literature with many fields like history, you have politics, philosophy, and literary traditions, and its significance in present-day society. The colonial countries started writing and depicting the experiences of colonization and many changes brought by independence upon individuals and their nations. In fact, the effects of colonialism was so deep that even after independence, many countries and cultures continue to suffer from its effect. Often the colonizer's language displaced the indigenous language. Many people abandoned indigenous religions after being converted to Christianity by missionaries. Even the post-colonial nations that emerged after independence were molded by missionaries. and even the post-colonial nations that were molded by European missionaries with the same type of administrative and bureaucratic setup. So given what a huge deal colonialism was, it is any wonder that writers from formerly colonized countries have become obsessed with understanding it, representing it, and challenging it. And given that the consequence of colonialism extended well beyond the actual period of decolonization, it is any wonder why writers are still dealing with the legacy of colonialism. In post-colonial literature, you will also see this valorization of cultural identity reflected in the narrative style of literary work. For example, a lot of post-colonial African literature resembles spoken language. This is because before colonialism, much of African literature was oral literature. People told stories and they sang poetry. In order to justify colonialism, colonizers had to make themselves believe that the people they were colonizing were somehow lesser than they were. Otherwise, they could not go off and enslave and kill and steal from so many people. One way they convinced themselves of their superiority by developing all kinds of stereotypes about different colonized groups. They were dangerous, they were untrustworthy, they were lazy. A big mission of post-colonial writers is to challenge these stereotypes and show that they are based on nothing but the biasness of the colonizers. I'm going to give an example of Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe as an example where post-colonial writers use the language of the colonizers to spread to the world what had happened. So while many Africans felt attacked by the presence of the Europeans within the border of their homeland, Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian author, recognized that English is very powerful, and he chose to implement it as a primary language within his literature. When scorned by his compatriots, Achebe said, and I quote, "I feel that the English language will be able to carry out the weight of my African experience," unquote. African writer and the English language has been used by the African writer Achebe is arguably more than any other work of African fiction. In a historical act of prophetic humanity, Achebe chose to write to Africans, but he wrote in English so that the entire world could read and comprehend what had happened during those times. Also, I'm going to explain the effect of labor migration that happened in The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta. So Emecheta illustrates the cultural collision between the Igbo and the Western culture when when the protagonist of The Joys of Motherhood, Nu Ego, she comes to the city of Lagos. When she gets married twice just because she could not produce children, give children to her first husband, then she gets married twice, and she comes to the city of Lagos to live with a second husband, and there she is shocked to see that her husband is working for a white family and does all the housework for the white family. So this protagonist, Nu Ego, came from a chiefly family. She had people to do work for her. She had brothers who would care for her, take care of her. But now that she's in this city, she also has to work. She has a very struggling life, and she suffers a lot. Her entire life is full of suffering as she struggles to provide for the needs and wants of her children. As a cigarette seller, she becomes a cigarette seller. And this capitalist approach shows us the effect of colonialism and on low-income earning families. I'm going to move on to Satyendra Nandan and specifically his writing on the Wounded Sea. So his fables about Fiji is kind of recollection to the past that has been witnessed by my ancestors, and something the way he uses his diction, it is a kind of it is very descriptive, and it rekindles a language and a culture that is complex, that has not been witnessed by this generation. His work also constitutes of things that make readers remind of their lack of rootlessness, their lack of permanence, as if to make them think as to what are their roots, where do they belong. Behind the literature of the Indian diaspora stands the gigantic figure of B.S. Naipaul. It was Naipaul who gave form to the language of the Gurmit ideology, and it was Naipaul who gave the Indian diaspora distinctive discourse and consciousness. Two fictive figures borrowed from Naipaul. They are Biswas and Ganesh Pandit. They sum up Nandan's character types. The tragic hero, Biswas, is trapped in the contradictions of the fragment and its fictions. Finally, fails to recognize himself in the mirror. And the comic hero, Ganesh, seeking release from the Gurmit ideology through the mastery of a colonial language by introjecting the Gurmit ideology and transforming it into a comic discourse. The comic heroes plunge on regardless. The tragic hero, a shadow of the totality left behind, play out Gautam's curse, from which release is possible only through Rama, but in a banished sort of way. Naipaul finds a center, a fictive order, initially positioning himself at the very heart of oppositions and tensions in the Gurmit ideology itself. It is a device not known to Western literature, certainly not unknown to Indian literature, where the authorial voice often expresses itself in a signature line such as Suno Kabira, Suno Bhai Sadhu, says Kabir the poet, listen to me, O fellows. The center in Nandan's fiction is also the self. The beginning of all his narratives is the writer himself, and throughout the Wounded Sea, the generic conventions and discursive domain of comedy mediates. Comedy mediates between the reconcilable yearnings of the rootless fragment poet's past and its desire to adopt to the new world. To conclude, in fact, as the post-colonial literature deals with framing identities, the politics of rewriting, translation, relation between nation and nationalism, it is a most dominant form of literature, and it has a great appeal. Post-colonialism mostly deals with many concepts like cultural, political, geographical, psychological, and post-colonial structure. It also has a major literature which helps in understanding both the colonizer and the colonized in many concerns like education, politics, geography, culture, and custom. Post-colonial has many motifs and themes like cultural dominism, racism, quest for identity, inequality, with some peculiar presentation styles. Most of the post-colonial writers reflected and demonstrated many thematic concepts which are quite connected with both the colonizer and the colonized. Finally, white Europeans continually accentuated on racial discrimination for their superiority over the colonized. Thank you. These are my references. That's all from my side. Thank you for listening. And I would like to thank the organizers for this program for giving us an opportunity to present on such a vital matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashna, for your presentation. The next presentation that we have is from Vanshi Varsha Kumar and Praveen Lata, who are going to share their views on the role of labor migration in shaping post-colonial literature. So Vashni and Praveen, who's going to be presenting.
Thank you, madam. It's Vashti. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I would like Mr. Deep Maharaj, he will be sharing the screen on my behalf. He'll be sharing the slides for me. Deep? Okay. Thank you so much, and warm greetings to everyone from Fiji Islands. My name is Ms. Vashni Varsha Kumar, and I'm a part-time teaching assistant at the University of Fiji. And first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present a paper for this e-conference, The Old and New Indenture, Labor Practices and Human Rights. And we had chosen, me and my partner, Ms. Praveen Lata, we had chosen the theme Construction of Identities, and our topic is the role of labor migration in shaping post-colonial literature. So with introduction, the heart-wrenching story of the indentured laborers in Fiji began in the year 1874 when Fiji signed its deed of cession to Great Britain. Indenture was basically a system of exploitation and control since ages. Beneath the untrammeled prosperity of Fiji lies the plight of an exploited migrant workforce who suffered brutality and cruelty of the overseers. The beginning of post-colonial literature was an attempt to expose the dreadful sides of colonialism on the colonized nations. Post-colonial literature primarily emerged at the time when many colonized nations were fighting their way to independence. It began in the mid-20th century as a cogent literary movement. During this period, a lot of classic post-colonial texts were written and published, whereby many writers revealed the deeper and darker secrets of colonialism. The key socio-historical trajectories inflected the post-colonial Pacific literature. Keown, in her research, elaborates that Pacific Islands writing offers a broad-ranging introduction to the post-colonial literatures of the Pacific regions. She indicates that the post-colonial Pacific literature takes its readers on a fathomless journey, discovering and investigating through a wide range of diverse cultural and literary contexts. Thus, this research paper entails to emphasize on the historical labor migration in Fiji. It also provides a brief historical background of the indenture system saga and accentuates on how the labor migration contributed to the conception of post-colonial Pacific literature, which will be the core argument of this writer. The paper focuses on few of the Pacific writers and focuses on themes like identity crisis, oppression, inequality, decolonization struggles, and the loss of indigenous culture and language. So the first subtopic here is the historical labor migration. The Indo-Fijians were brought from India as indentured laborers to work on plantations in Fiji. The recruitment began in 1879 and ended in 1916, mainly from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and later from South India. Colonialism provided places where labor was desired and encouraged it to exploit opportunities offered for cash employment in far-off colonies. Those whose task was to recruit laborers painted glorious pictures of the would-be destination, and those in impoverished circumstances fell prey to such descriptions. The journey of these indentured laborers gave a direction to the post-colonial Pacific literature. Their plights and struggles became the utmost important subject in this discourse. Many Pacific writers directed their writings on the injustice done to these Indian migrants and focused on issues like identity crisis, loss of indigenous culture and language, oppression, and inequality. Post-colonial Pacific discourse. Post-colonial theory is a body of thought primarily concerned with accounting for the political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of European colonial rule and the world in the 18th through the 20th century. Post-colonial theory takes many different shapes and interventions, but all share a fundamental claim that the world we inhabit is impossible to understand except in relationship to the history of imperialism and colonial rule. Edward Said's book, Orientalism, published in 1978, is regarded as the basis of the development of the post-colonial theory. Said believes that Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. In his book, he reveals that the West had painted a false image of the colonizers fabricated by the Western writers and explorers. He claims that the Western post-colonial discourse is a fabrication to justify the horrors that accompany colonialism. The earliest written works by Pacific Islanders were mission-inspired autobiographical writings in the vernacular languages. No fictional or imaginative writing emerged during this early period. In the 1970s, reacting against the distortions in the European vision of the Pacific, writers such as Albert Wendt of Samoa argued for a literature written by Pacific Islanders. Both Subramani emphasized the function of indigenous writing as being primarily to refute and recast prejudicial Western type of islanders. Finally, post-colonial theory has influenced the way we read texts, the way we understand national and transnational histories, and the way we understand the political relations of our own knowledge as scholars. Some of the themes in Pacific literature: identity crisis. Post-colonial Pacific literature articulates and mediates Pacific identity through the creative work of many prominent Pacific scholars. Albert Wendt is one of the most prominent and influential post-colonial writers in the Pacific today. His writing centers primarily in Samoa, where he was born in 1939. Gender and racial identity politics are at the heart of Albert Wendt's books and novels. An epic spanning 3 generations, Leaves of the Banyan Tree, tells the story of a family and community in Western Samoa, exploring on a grand scale such universal themes as colonialism, exploitation, identity crisis, and revenge. Albert Wendt's novella, Polioli, and his teenage rebel characters, Peep and Tagata in Flying Fox in a Freedom Tree, describe the difficult, sometimes self-destructive attempt to hold ancient grounds of being held up against Christian doctrine. Similarly, Wilsoni Herenico and Teresia Teau's drama, The Last Virgin in Paradise, highlights the conflicts emerging, especially in regards to the issues of political and cultural identities. It focuses on the ways that colonialism impacted on the Pacific and their related effects on the quest of Pacific Islanders for new post-colonial cultural identities and liberalization from the past. Another professor of literature, Subramani, who also produced the first book-length academic study of modern Pacific writing, had already written a suite of stories about Indian indenture labor and modern restlessness. Subramani's short story, Marigolds, highlights a slow anguish grips my heart, the anguish of being unsupported. Everything history and custom had prepared me for this impasse. There is no alternative life. 100 years of history on these islands has resulted in wilderness and distress. This was in the Fantasy Eaters, published in 1988. This history is also fictionalized in a more upbeat way in J.S. Conwell's The Morning, published in 1992. Vijay Mishra, an academic, author, and cultural theorist, implies that all diasporas are unhappy, but every diaspora is unhappy in its own way. He claims that diaspora people do not feel happy with their non-hyphenated identities, as indicated on their passports. The hyphenated identity is Indo-Fijian, while the passport holds them as Fijian. Thus, the appropriate new identity has been a long-standing battle for the Fiji Indian, upwardly mobile and middle and upper classes. Therefore, identity crisis has demonstrated its power as one of the main thematic concerns in post-colonial literature. Now, I would like my partner, Ms. Parveen Lata, to take on from here.
Thank you, Ms. Vashni, and good evening to everyone. Our next theme is oppression and social inequality. Indenture in Fiji was a system of oppression through which the labor of Indian migrants was extracted largely by coercive control. The severity of Indo-Fijian indenture has attracted the most attention from contemporaries as well as from later historians. In 2017, Subramani, a prominent Indo-Fijian author, critic, and academic, reissued his collection, The Fantasy Eaters, adding new short stories and entitling the volume Wild Flowers. The reissue of Subramani's shorter writings brings the trajectory of Indo-Fijian literary engagements with colonialism, indenture, cultural tensions, and unsettled identities back into focus. On arrival in Fiji, offenses against the workers such as corporal punishment, irregular payment, poor rations, sexual abuse, and unsanitary inadequate housing were rife and resulted in Fiji having one of the highest rates of suicide of the indentured colonies. Rajendra Prasad's book, Tears in Paradise, Suffering the Struggles of Indians in Fiji, reveals the horrific treatment of Indian indentured workers in Fiji by the British from 1879 to 1919. The indenture system under which they were recruited was slavery by another name. Working and living conditions were so atrocious that Fiji had the highest rate of suicide in the world and the highest rate of infanticide among the colonies that deployed indentured labor. Even K.L. Gillian, writing specifically on Fiji and attempting to maintain a balance, admitted that it was not without reason that Indians referred to plantation life as Narak or hell. Professor Brijlal is best known among Pacific historians for his writings on the contemporary history of Fiji. In his book, Chalo Jahaji, On a Journey Through Indenture in Fiji, he has emphasized on the struggles and oppression of the Indian indentured laborers in Fiji. For the laborers, work was hard and energy was sapped, not only by such toil, but also through debilitating illnesses, poor and insufficient food, and inadequate sanitation. In a short story, Eric Wolff called The Plantation a class-structured system of organization, where the laborer sold his muscular energy and was paid for its use in the services of surplus production. Wolff holds that where a plantation has existed, it has destroyed the existing cultural values and imposed its own dictates, sometimes by the use of compulsion. The pain of Indo-Fijians is like a supporting wound that is not allowed to heal, as racist bigots lurk in the shadows to pounce on them at every turn, as highlighted by Rajendra Prasad. Overseers' brutality, abuse of the laborers when they were whipped, women's head bashing on the stones, the longer working hours, heavily pregnant mothers to be still on the fields and after birth to return to work within days, and other behavior involving physical force intending to kill someone was practiced on the Girmitias. Writers such as Satyendra Nandan and Vijay Naidu have also highlighted about the trauma faced by indentured laborers at the hands of British colonizers. Satyendra Nandan in his poem, Tortoise Tale, depicts the oppression as he writes, rations, homicide and attempted homicide, suicide, general physical violence, and sexual violence. Naidu gave a brief account of indentured laborers by publishing a portion of interviews by Girmitias. He interviewed a Girmitia named Martha Naikar, who told that both men and women got hiding by the overseers who lifted their clothes and kicked them in bottom. Another Girmitia, Basir Muhammad, highlighted in his interview that his pregnant wife was whipped while she was hoeing the field. A heart-wrenching story of Girmitias. Narayani goes, as Ahmad Ali writes, that Narayani's case epitomizes Girmit. He elaborates about her being trustful, innocent, and a beautiful teenager from Mathura who seeks a new life in a new land. Her child died after 4 days of birth. She was instructed to return to work. Feeling weak, Narayani chose to take a rest, but was critically beaten by the overseer, thus ending up in the hospital. Classified as broken in body, devastated in spirit, she could never live a normal life. Due to her excruciating pains and sorrows, she labeled Girmit as Narak, meaning hell. A similar suffering was experienced by Kunti, a Girmitia as well, who was sexually molested by the Sardars and overseers. Believed to be a quarrelsome woman and to be punished for this behavior, an overseer made an indecorous proposal to her. Anyhow, Kunti managed to free herself from the disobedient overseer and flung into a nearby river. Larry Thomas, a renowned Pacific playwright and director, highlights about issues of race, poverty, and inequality through his play Outcasts and his film A Race for Plights. After independence, Fiji became a multiracial society whereby different races of people resided. However, there was always racial tension as Indo-Fijians were considered inferior by the indigenous race. Thomas, however, through his film, A Race for Rights, showcases this difference and tries to signify the importance of unity and living together in a multiracial nation. Outcasts highlights the issues of poverty and inequality. Thomas raises a question on the credibility of the society we live in, and also enables the readers to understand the way we treat one another despite gaining independence. Given the emphasis on race, both in plantation life and the colonial environment in Fiji, one might suggest that Indian laborers who had fled caste found themselves engulfed by another form of discrimination, which too was determined by the accident of birth and not through personal choice or achievement. Moving on, decolonization. Decolonization, the mind, the politics of language in African literature, by the Kenyan novelist and post-colonial theorist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, is a collection of essays about language and its constructive role in national culture, history, and identity. The book, which advocates linguistic decolonization, is one of Ngugi's best known, the most cited non-fiction publications. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is one writer who tried his best to revive and revalue local language through his literature. As in Africa, Thiong'o's writing had been at the forefront of decolonizing the model. According to Ahmad, an Indian critic, India also had considerable advocacy where, due to the unbroken power of local languages and their literary traditions throughout the colonial period, a strong drive to revalue the literatures and other arts employing Indian languages led to the revival of it. The Tongan scholar Konehelu Seiman discusses the paradox and necessity of decolonizing higher education. Konehelu Seiman claims that decolonizing Pacific studies is about reclaiming indigenous perspectives, knowledge, and wisdom that have been devalued or suppressed because they were or are not considered important or worthwhile. Tracy Bainivanua shows us how Pacific people engaged with a worldwide political consciousness, committed to asserting their own histories and futures. At last, a history of decolonization in the Pacific from an indigenous perspective that makes us rethink conventional understandings of the process of decolonization itself, what it is, should be, and was. Moving on to loss of indigenous culture and language. Language is often a central question. Post-colonial study.
Can you wrap up your presentation in half a minute, please? Thank you.
Okay, madam. In my conclusion, labor migration plays a significant role in shaping post-colonial literature, mainly the Pacific literature, as many post-colonial texts are based on the plight and struggles of the indentured laborers. Had it not been for the indenture system, the people of the Pacific nations would not have seen the hidden talents of their local writers, such as Satyendra Nandan, Subramani, Albert Wendt, Konehelu Seiman, Sudesh Mishra, who with their commendable writings have written the history through the eyes of the Girmitias themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen, and for an enlightening presentation on the Girmit literature. Our next presentation is by Salesh Lal, and he's going to present to us Prompting the Past, Evoking an Actor's Perspective on Labor-Motivated Indo-Fijian Diaspora in, of course, Larry Thomas Place. I welcome Salesh Lal, and he's from USP. So let's see what he has to share with us. Over to you, Salesh.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Isambula Vinaka, namaste. My name is Salesh Lal, and I teach literature at the University of the South Pacific. Madam Chair, Dr. Chand has requested that we say a little bit about ourselves as introduction. I just wanted to say that I've delved a little on the stage, especially between the years of 1997 to 2008. Incidentally, those were considered the golden years of theater in Fiji. I don't know whether it was because of me, but I like to think that way. The stage is a fascinating place to be on because it allows you to see the world differently. The audience goes in thinking that they're going to see the actors, they're going to see a story unfold. But please keep in mind, trust me when I tell you this, the actors are watching you back. Emerging from my experiences of theater, I present to you Prompting the Past, evoking an actor's perspective on labor-motivated Indo-Fijian diaspora in Thomas's plays. For the purpose of this presentation, I will first look at why a theater actor's perspective allows insights into society. This will be followed by a brief look at why analytical autoethnography is a viable method for documenting personal experiences in academia. And then I look at the presentation of how three theater characters, Sam from Men, Women and Insanity, Tim from Searching for the Smile, and Vishwa from The Visitors represent the Indo-Fijian community. So firstly, the actor's perspective. In a 2018 book, Acting the Basics, Bella Merlin forwards the important role actors played historically in society. She suggests that early in the history of mankind, one way of fathoming the controlling forces of the universe was by manifesting these forces into recognizable human forms. Thus, acting, and by virtue of association, actors, have fulfilled an important role in the evolution of society as we experience it today. As an actor who had very limited training, I was often expected to study and provide my own interpretations on the characters I was representing. Providing a realistic portrayal seemed natural. In doing so, I adapted Stanislavski's idea of establishing the character's inner life. Well, he played a lot of emphasis on training the actor to become the character. Consequently, as theater became more than just acting for me, analyzing my performances became equally important. I feel that the perspective of an actor is able to transcend boundaries of social and theatrical acting. So much so that self-reflection forms an important component for this particular presentation, which in itself is a result of analytical autoethnography. Now, analytical autoethnography, it is often difficult for a researcher to isolate previous personal experiences and prejudices. Leon Anderson emphasized that even as far back as 1923, he relied heavily on personal experiences, especially about homeless men. In iterating this view further, Atkinson emphasized that the long tradition of life history has been predicated on close relationships between the researcher and the informant. Caroline Ellis refers to autoethnography as research, writing, and method that connect the autobiographical and personal to the cultural and social. It incorporates the contribution of the researcher. However, it is not fully autobiographical, as a notion of critical awareness remains. Now, Leon Anderson adds analytical autoethnography as a further development, proposing exponents as complete member researcher status analytical reflexivity, narrative visibility of the researcher's self, dialogue with informants beyond the self, and commitment to theoretical analysis. Anderson feels that analytical autoethnography not only truthfully renders the social world under investigation, but also transcends the same world through broader generalizations. Now, I begin by applying this to the first of the three plays that I'm going to look at: Man, Women, and Insanity. The play Man, Women, and Insanity was written as Thomas's response to the 1987 coups. The action centers around 7 youths who are at an after-hours drinking party at the back of an isolated factory. This naturalistic play focuses on the youths and 2 older, mentally unstable characters. As the play proceeds, the mood of the drinking party slowly transforms from the jovial to the argumentative, verging on violence. People from Fiji would know what I'm talking about. The play centers on the interactions between the 7 youths and is punctuated by Sam's monologues, which in themselves can also be regarded as an adjacent commentary on life in Fiji. Sam's character remains enigmatic throughout the play. The backstory is that Sam, a civil servant educated in England, started showing signs of mental distress upon independence, and even more so after the return to Britain of the colonial administrators. In the opening scene, he makes an intriguing impact on the audience with 3 monologues, one after each other, one each from Martin Luther King, Mao Zedong, and Enric Hines, as if advertising his arsenal of quotes to them. In doing so, he is also declaring his position as the group philosopher to the audience. Throughout the play, he quotes from a diverse range of thinkers, philosophers, and texts, revealing his repertoire. Sam is able to captivate the audience's imagination, forcing them to debate between the intelligence he portrays and the insanity he represents in the play. In preparing for Sam, the physical transformation was achieved with ease. The psychology of the character, well, that took more time. I had decided early that as a British-trained ex-civil servant, I would ensure that despite my depressing appearance, I would compensate for it by my polished language and pompous mannerisms. A clash of the exaggerated exhibition of dignified mannerisms and his disheveled look helped establish a reflection of an independent Fiji trying its best to overcome its colonial shackles, an artistic sediment of the colonizer. Being an Indo-Fijian actor playing Sam, I couldn't help but notice his ability to transcend the stage's boundaries. His essence in the narrative of the play represents the fluidity of the Indo-Fijian identity. Because of the years of adapting and adopting their cultural identity, Indo-Fijians have obviously transcended the culture that their ancestors initially brought with them from India. My interpretation of Sam's Indo-Fijianness draws on the philosophical struggles and the historical reflections of Indo-Fijians in Fiji. I displayed that the disintegration of an Indo-Fijian Sam represents the subsequent disintegration of Fiji as a nation because of the close association between the two. It reflects that the relationship between Indo-Fijians and Fiji is of mutual reliance, where the detriment or benefit of either is mirrored in the other. The second play is Searching for the Smile. Now, this play is set in a bar. No barrier was created to segregate the audience from the actors. Such an ambience suggested that the audience was an extension of the bar scene, silent revelers privileged enough to eavesdrop onto the private conversations that were taking place. Searching for the Smile is the search of 11 diverse individuals for happiness. What initially seems to be the disjointed narratives of four couples, each lamenting their own losses and aspirations, are woven together by the intrusion of the waiter, Tim. The relaxed conversations in the play are punctuated by two violent episodes involving the mentally disturbed Antonio, who remains the disturbing presence in the otherwise deceivingly peaceful setting of the play. The audience often links their personal experiences with what they see on stage, leading to an interpretation of the play as they watch the action unfold. Although implicit, the relationship between Tim and the audience was symbiotic, as they both fed off each other's presence. The role of Tim the waiter was initially conceived as an Itoke character, but adjustments were made to the script to incorporate an Indo-Fijian actor. Thus, the Indo-Fijian ethnicity of the actor was a determinant in the portrayal of the character. Tim is tasked with moving the action by his skillfully choreographed movements. In his exchanges with the tourist Peter, Tim reveals a side to his personality which promotes the friendly image of the people usually found on tourist brochures. The sincerity of his promotions are unclear, but he readily reaffirms Peter's romantic expressions of Fiji. As an Indo-Fijian Tim, he also emphasizes that life on the farms was tiring yet satisfying. This is significant, as the Indo-Fijian population were mostly products of farm life. He endorses an image of the islands where you are surrounded by the idyllic sea, sand, and sun. However, with the play being produced in 1999 at a time when Indo-Fijian farmers were increasingly losing their sugarcane farm leases, it was difficult for an Indo-Fijian farm boy like Tim to convincingly promote life in rural Fiji. This atmosphere of uncertainty for the Indo-Fijians helped me fashion Tim's identity. My experiences of playing an Indo-Fijian Tim in the play paralleled with the historical experiences of Indo-Fijians reveal that Fiji remains a place where they have been able to grow roots. However, such roots do not get shaken when new routes are embarked upon. They transplant and grow in new environments under new conditions. In fact, a character in the play, Jacob, shows that roots and routes intertwine to allow for stronger roots and more diverse routes. Tim recognized his attachment to the farm and the lifestyle in Fiji as a reason for choosing his preferred country. There are many Indo-Fijians who similarly remain attached to Fiji and refuse to leave. The final play I'm looking at for this presentation is The Visitors. Set in an urban city in Fiji, the play revolves around the invasion of an Indo-Fijian home by a pair of Itoke intruders. The couple, Manju and Vishwa, suffer a harrowing night of torture and blackmail as the intruders interrogate the businessman Vishwa and his wife Manju, eventually revealing the shady side of Vishwa, who has amassed a stash of gold and cash illegally, which he intends to use to start a new life in Brisbane. The play ends with Vishwa pleading with his wife to migrate, a prospect the patriotic Manju is still very reluctant about. On being offered the role of Vishwa, I found the script captivating, but the character a little repulsive, although I could see parallels in a combined fondness for Fiji. I agreed to the role because of the challenges it posed. The play starts with Vishwa preparing to retire for the day. I had to establish him early, so I started the play by humming and singing a line from the 1957 Hindi movie Bhabhi, and the song is Chal Ud Ja Re Panchi Ke Ab Ye Desh Hua Begana. This line of the song loosely translates as "Fly away bird, for this country isn't yours anymore." In preparing for this character, I constantly, consciously returned to the song as it helped me establish Vishwa's psyche. I found parallels between the feelings of statelessness evoked in the song to that felt by Indo-Fijians treated as outsiders, especially during political upheavals and elections. I initially found it difficult to portray the change occurring in Vishwa's character from victim to villain in the climax scene. The intruders start revealing Vishwa's illegal activities to his wife and to the audience. I do not have enough lines in that scene to argue my innocence, except to emote. So what could I do? The solution was in emulating the behavior of famous Indian villain of the 80s, Prem Chopra, who was a master at emoting. This proved effective for me as Prem Chopra helped me execute similar emotions effectively on a Fijian stage. In both these instances, during the preparatory stages for my character, my ancestral connection to India, now restricted mostly to Indian films, assisted me in realizing that a bond, however weak, still remains with the land of my ancestors. I empathized that Vishwa's anger emanated because of his displacement from the family land. While Manju believed that they belonged to Fiji, so needed to stay, Vishwa is of the view that they would continue to belong even if they left. In The Visitors, Manju and Vishwa both emerge as contrasting yet legitimate Indo-Fijian voices representing the dreams, concerns, and the worries of their people. To conclude, I present how analytical autoethnography can be used to present an actist perspective of life in Fiji. I traced 3 Larry Thomas's characters, Sam of Men, Women, and Insanity, Tim in Searching for a Smile, and Vishwa from The Visitors to reveal how their professions and ethnicity helped determine their representations on stage. In doing so, I inadvertently end up representing Indo-Fijians as important players in Fiji's social, economic, and political development. My references for this presentation are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salesh, for your interesting presentation, where you gave us an actor's perspective on what it feels like being on the stage and trying to portray what an Indo-Fijian feels like. Our next presentation is supposed to be by Neha Singh and Sushma Pandey from India. However, we don't seem to be having them online in the waiting room. So instead, we will now move to Ritu Tyagi. Ritu Tyagi is going to talk to us, speak to us on post-indenture Indian diaspora and gender, rewriting myths by women writers. And she hails from Pondicherry University, India. Welcome, Ritu. We look forward to hearing from you. All yours.
Can you hear me? Can you see and hear me?
Yes, we can see you.
Hello.
And we can hear you as well. Hello.
Hello to all of you, and a very big thank you to the organizers who have managed to bring around 100 presenters together in a very efficient manner. Thanks a lot for allowing me this opportunity to share my research within this forum. It means a big thing for me. And I am actually an assistant professor in the Department of French at Pondicherry University, India. Mostly working on Francophone literature, and I have a book published on Ananda Devi, Indo-Mauritian writer, quite well known within the Francophone world. But from that, I branched into the Anglophone world as well. And I was recently having a project funded by ICSSR, a government funding agency in India, in which I was looking at post-indentured Indian diaspora, particularly with a gendered perspective. And this research comes from that, as well as from my book that was published with Brill Rodopi in 2013. The book is in English on Ananda Devi. I'll begin with my presentation, and apologies for not being able to show you my PPT because I have logged in from another device from my phone. I was unable to log in from my laptop. So that is why I won't be able to show the PPT. I apologize for that. The title of my presentation today is Rewriting Myths in Post-Endangered Indian Women Writing, emphasizing myth's role in the construction of humankind and its socio-cultural reality. Mircea Eliade notes that myth is powerful not only because it constitutes the knowledge of the origin, but also because it constructs and reinforces the socio-cultural reality of man. Roland Barthes further insists that, I quote, "There is no fixity in mythical concepts. They can come into being, alter, disintegrate, disappear completely, and that around the meaning of myth, there is a halo of virtualities where other possible meanings are floating," end of quotation. The fact that myths are endlessly told and retold allows for multiple versions and interpretations. By scrutinizing myths, therefore, one can work to, I again quote from Barthes, loosen its negative strangleholds and sew new variations into its weave, end of quotation. Several feminist critics insist that mythologies originated not in the worship of masculine god, but in the devotion of the mother goddess, and argue, I quote from Sellers, "The patriarchal myths we have inherited derive their potency from stolen mythical power." Therefore, the need to rewrite these myths in ways fruitful for women emancipation. By focusing on two novels, one is Le Vol de Draupadi, Draupadi's Veil, by Indo-Mauritian writer Ananda Devi, and the other one is The Swinging Bridge by Indo-Trinidadian Ramabai Espinet. This paper will examine the rewriting of myths around the epic of Ramayana by women writers from post-endangered Indian diaspora in ways that allow them to challenge passive and stereotypical representations of women and find means to connect women across generations. And I'm particularly interested in understanding the evolution of myths far from the motherland within the diasporic context and how that informs our understanding of religion and women today from the Indian perspective. So Devi's Veil is a novel, Draupadi's Veil, is a novel written by Indo-Mauritian contemporary writer Ananda Devi that recounts the tale of Anjali, married into an urban modern family who has a son who's unfortunately suffering from terminal illness. Her in-laws insist that she offer sacrifice by walking on fire to save him. She, though very upset with the proposition, particularly because she had seen her own cousin Vasanti perform the ritual and die in the process, decides to go for it. When her son is not saved in the end after having gone through the sacrifice, she decides to leave her husband and live with a female friend. This novel relies heavily on mythological figures from the Indian epics Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the religious practice of fire walking. The Draupadi of the title is not the protagonist of the novel, but a character from Mahabharata. The reader also finds references to Sita, another mythical figure from the epic Ramayana. Firewalking, as most of you know, is an ancient practice amongst the Hindu Tamil diaspora in Mauritius. Many devotees walk barefoot on a rectangular area covered with burning coals during the festival of Kavadi as an act of sacrifice and self-mortification. Mythologically, we also know that the act of firewalking is associated with the character of Sita in the epic Ramayana. And in this epic, Sita walks through fire to prove her fidelity and chastity towards her husband and to protect his honor as a man and as a king, thereby demonstrating her devotion as a true wife. Amongst the Hindu community worldwide, Sita is worshipped as a goddess for exemplary life she led as a virtuous wife. In Draupadi's Veil, the sacrificial act of firewalking takes place twice, inspired by Sita's miraculous escape from fire that asserts her purity. Anjali's cousin Vasanti attempts to imitate this mythological act in order to prove her fidelity and love towards Anjali's brother. She, however, meets with a tragic end as no fire goddess intervenes to protect her. Vasanti's act then demonstrates a strong belief in Hindu mythology, not as a narrative that recounts tales of gods and goddesses, but as a reality relevant to the contemporary world. Whereas Vasanti had absolute belief in the power of the myth and her act aimed at reasserting it, Anjali's repetition of the same act in the novel questions the myths, exposing their superstitious nature. She views them as patriarchal coding imposed on ancient as well as contemporary women. If in the Ramayana it was a question of Ram's pride that forced Sita to undergo the act of sacrifice, in Draupadi's Veil, it is Dev Anjali's husband's pride in front of his family members which is at stake. And of particular interest here is the reaction of the two characters, Sita and Anjali. Sita does walk on fire the first time to prove her chastity, but she refuses the second time. Instead, she asks the Mother Earth to give her refuge, implying, an act of suicide in that case. And many critics, such as Sally Sutherland and Alf Beetle, have seen it as passive resistance. Anjali in the novel, however, walks on fire for a different reason. She does not believe in the act of sacrifice and is under no illusion that it will heal her son. Neither is her act an attempt to save her marriage, as one might believe. Although she is depicted in the novel as a very submissive person, her unpredictable act of leaving her husband towards the end of the novel, immediately after she accomplishes the sacrifice, proves contrary to the depiction. Having successfully undergone the ritual sacrifice, Anjali comes out not as a believer, but rather as a liberated person. Moreover, Anjali's abandonment of her husband after the fire walking is particularly compelling, as it subverts not only the mythological significance of the act, but also the prevalent notion of a dutiful wife. It neither affirms her husband's authority nor safeguards his honor, as does Sita's in the first case. Rather, it subverts her husband's authority and male pride. However, it is the climax of the novel that makes it an even more compelling rewriting of the Sita episode. In the last scene, drunk Anjali broods over a new beginning with a woman named Fatima. This end implies a renewal and a rebirth for Anjali, unlike Sita's abandonment of Ram by seeking refuge in Mother Earth, viewed widely as a misogynistic act. Then Draupadi's presence in the same text adds a new dimension to the novel, as it allows Devi, the writer, and the reader to compare the two mythical figures, Sita and Draupadi. Draupadi enters the text in an extraordinary moment when Anjali prepares to walk on fire and notices Draupadi's sari on the rectangular circle of burning coals. Sita is revered across India for her exemplary devotion towards Rama, whereas Draupadi is understood to be an aggressive wife who became the cause of a deadly war between brothers. When she is called to the court to be stripped by her brother's cousin, as her husband's lost her in a match of dice, Draupadi's incessant, intelligent, aggressive questioning, her articulate and forceful nature, her persistent dwelling on the treatment meted out to her by the Kauravas, observes Sutherland, frees her husbands from slavery and eventually, leads to the war. Sutherland further believes that it is Draupadi's aggression that prevents her from being the idol for most Indian women. I quote, "It is the same aggressive behavior and outspokenness of Draupadi coupled with the inability of her husbands to protect her that prevents her, unlike other heroines of the Sanskrit tradition, from becoming idolized as the perfect wife." Draupadi is not the idol mythical heroine like Sita due to her conscientiousness. Devi, however, favors her over Sita in her novel. As Anjali walks on fire, she does not repeat Sita's act of devotion and chastity towards her husband, exemplifying the duties of a good wife, but rather subverts it. In Anjali's resistance, it is Draupadi's sari that comes to her rescue as she walks on fire. Draupadi then protects Anjali in the same way as Krishna saved Draupadi by miraculously making her sari so long that no one could ever pull it off. By evoking Draupadi's sari not only in the title of the novel, but also as the veil that protects Anjali, Devi favors Draupadi's notion of femininity, which is undoubtedly more aggressive. Anjali definitely desires to follow the route paved by Draupadi. In according importance to mythical heroine like Draupadi, whose aggressive behavior makes her unpopular and unfit to be an idle wife or an idle woman, Devi is questioning the myths that aim at imposing unachievable idols of wifehood and femininity. In judging Dev unfit for her devotion and fidelity, Anjali no longer adheres to the notion of idle wifehood and goes beyond Sita and Draupadi. In refusing to submit to Dev's whims and male pride, she paves the way for new possibilities and alternatives for contemporary women. Both Ramayana, the epic, and the mythological character of Sita reappear in another novel, The Swinging Bridge by Ramabai Espinette, as the narrator searching for the stories of her great-grandmother Gaindar comes across the character of another old lady named Babuni from the time of her great-grandmother, who, like many others, had taken the ship from India. So I'll just quickly narrate the story. It is a novel that came out in 2003 published with HarperCollins and immediately shortlisted for the Regional Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2004, and narrates the story of Mona, who, much like Ramabai Espinette, lives in Canada, having migrated from Trinidad. Her brother, Kalo, is terminally ill and asks her to visit Trinidad in the hope of buying back their ancestral property. This takes her back to her native country and a certain lost past. This work then becomes a retrieval narrative, tracing the story of her great-grandmother Gander and another woman, Babuni, who had boarded the ship from India. The work describes the near impossibility of reconstructing a past that has been ignored by many dominant histories, but effectively uses other means such as recipes, family albums, songs, folk tales to bring out the lost past in order to give dignity and dignity long denied to her ancestors who had crossed the Kalapani. And this discovery, interestingly, is also a personal quest for finding identity between different cultures, countries, and languages. Both the characters, Gander and Babuni, are fond of singing Ramayana. Though heard many times, the word Ramayana didn't evoke much in the narrator's mind, but she understood that the ladies who sung it were called for kathas from time to time, and that it was a significant cultural marker for Indo-Caribbean identity on the island. The narrator, however, discovers on keen observation that Ramayana Gander, her great-grandmother, sang was, I quote, not the real Ramayana you know. She used to sing the kind village women would sing, end of quotation, thereby indicating the shift the mythological narratives undergo with time and space. As Olo Bacht explains, that mythological narrations have multiple variations and the possibility of the narrator to see himself or herself in the story. They can even modify the story according to the audience and the place or according to their desires. Gander was not allowed by her husband to continue singing Ramayana as some of the words in the songs were objectionable. Gander was a widowed prostitute who had boarded the ship from India to Trinidad. The narrator comes to know about her great-grandmother only through sources outside her family and had to excavate her story through other women on the island as well as through her grandmother's recipe and shop list books only. She's able to retrieve many of Gander's songs that were forgotten or deliberately hidden from the family archives, excluded thereby from the familial history. And I quote, all of it was there, everything about us, where we came from, our connection to despised women like Gander Bihari, like Babuni, the journey on the ships of endanger in the 19th century, but it was recorded only in her grandmother's recipe books. This itself symbolizes the stronghold of patriarchal norms in the Indo-Trinidadian families that silenced or erased, if we could say, unwanted women from their family archives. Babuni is another such character who's seen singing Ramayana in the novel in the present of the narrator. And the narrator explains that Babuni was abandoned by her family. Alone, she lived like a destitute and was often attacked by men at night. When a glorious epic like Ramayana is sung by destitutes like Gander and Babuni, it loses its Brahminical import and acquires new meanings and interpretations as it becomes a means to carry forward new tales of the downtrodden, tales of misery and songs of untold, unexpressed sorrow and resilience. I quote from the text. The whole world grieving in unison, crying tears into the river that flowed inches from my head, threatening to carry me in its rushing waters down to the sea. I listened to music and a story, till then unknown to me, coming through the wailing voice of an old beggar woman, crying through the rain, breaking up the classical words of the Ramayana with her own tale of exile and banishment, and in the broken chords and unexpected riffs, telling the story of a race of racial and tribal grief, of banishment, of test of purity. End of citation. If Sita exiled herself for the sake of her husband to carry the responsibility of his oath and could return home by walking in fire, these women are those successors of Sita who were denied the possibility of moral resurrection through fire, denied the possibility of returning home. They were either runaway satis or abandoned widows who could not be placed on their husband's pyres due to some reason. They ran away themselves or due to the British law that banned the practice of sati. I quote from the text. And in the face of renewed opposition to their freedom, women like Babuni, like my great-grandmother Gander, sang songs stringing together with bawdy humor, tenderness, pain, and honesty, the scattered beats of their new lives. Singing Ramayana They called these nights of singing when women would get together to listen. Like the Vaishnavite women of Bengal, they sang the words of love and loss. They sang moral tales and stories of surviving their new life. Gendar sang these songs, and grandmother Lil hid them for her safekeeping in the back of her shop books. Lily recorded them for her daughters, for my cousin Bess, for my sister Babsi, for me, for all the women to come, for my film that would tell Gendar's story. Their songs not only bring them together, but they hold significance even to contemporary generations as they reveal to the present generation the facts that accounts of history, be it official or familial, have tried to erase. This is precisely the reason the narrator sees them as a blessing. And I quote from the text, but now pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. How Babuni must have had no real name, and how much cruelty must have gone into naming her Babuni, meaning young girl. How she was singing Ramayana alone in Tutsi's hut, singing of such abandonment that words lost their power and only raw sound could capture it, pelting the broken shards of that holy text into the night, singing her grief. And I listened again as though to a blessing, hearing Babuni's strong voice washed in rain. End of quotation. When Ramayana, what Ramayana could these, if I could say, unburnt and therefore impure Sitas, who are exiled forever, not only from their homeland, but from all domestic life, narrate? Would their stories be that of grandeur or unrecountable resilience? The narrator comes to understand that their Ramayana is far from a relic from the past. It is a very lived experience of sense of solidarity that ties these Sitas together in an unbound sense of fraternity, a space that allowed them to narrate their tales of survival and incredible resilience. Now, Gendar's songs also find their way in Ramabai Espinet's text. And I had all the songs on the PPT because I wanted to comment on these songs. I'll just read one of these songs and then comment on it. This is song number 2. Your hands that burn me again. Your eyes that see through me, turn to me, turning again. Your lips I never knew, press me, kiss me again. On the rock, black against the sky, on the rock, there until you die. Touch me, burn me, press me again. Your hair so black, your skin so dark. My Lord, your touch like fire and salt. Your eyes that burn, my Lord, I reach the black rock in my dreams. Sweet sleep, take me away on the rock, my love, until I die. Touch me, burn me, burn me, burn me again. Gendar songs that find their way in the novel need a special mention to understand how their Ramayana, instead of a space of absolute devotion and submission, becomes a site of resistance and resilience. So here the narrator, who escapes the pyre of her husband, repeats, burn me again and again, showing her eagerness to be burnt alive, but not for the fake pride of the patriarchal society that sees no worth in the life of a wife whose husband is dead, but for one who's willing to be burnt in the fire of love. She then reverses the semiotics of fire walking or the fire test of purity that Sita had to undergo in order to return to Ayodhya, or the test of purity that Indian women have to undergo throughout their lives. In another song, I won't be reading that, Gendar again says, burn me again. Here she asks her partner to walk through fire for her, demanding a sense of equality between the two. And it is then that she will be like Sita and Lakshmi, filling the house with divine light. So exploring the evolution and myths around Ramayana and understanding that their interpretations are always influenced by local circumstances, particularly within the diasporic context, allows us to understand the fluid nature of myths and mythologies and calls into question the sense of fixity and purity usually attached to mythology and religion. It demystifies then the process of construction of mythology and religiosity, enabling us to understand the constructed nature of mythology and religion. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ritu. It was a very beautiful presentation, taking us back to the diasporic reflection on the books that the whole Gurmit society has actually lived with. So this brings us to the end of this session, which was called Language, Literature, and Creative Arts. And we now have the opportunity to have any discussion, question and answers to the questions which have been shared with us on the question and answer window that we have for Zoom. But before we actually begin that, let us have a look at what do we understand by language, literature, and creative arts in the Gurmit diaspora itself. When we talk about language, we have already seen the kind of discussions we have had gives us a challenge. Are we using the language for identity, or are we forced to use the language of the colonists? Because we believe that may be a way to actually share our views to a larger audience, because the diasporic language that we have, or the Gurmit language that we may not have the type of an audience that we believe or we should think it should have. Then we look at literature, and literature itself has shown us through the various presentations quite a lot of avenue that we have. We have biographies, we have autobiographies, we have poetry, which some of you have shared. We have the critical views in the form of how feminism has been portrayed in literature itself, as well as things like the voices of the oppressed, which you would see as something that comes again and again in the various forms of literature that the diasporic community, whether it was Indian or whether it was any other that we have actually seen here, they all have something in common, where the voices of the oppressed has been echoed again and again. Then there is the other form of the creative arts itself. We haven't touched a lot, but the other things that need to be, I think, thought of is painting, sculpture, architecture. Those are the ones which haven't been given much reflection. Again, music is very common, which is also very popular in the Indian diaspora itself, and all the various diasporic communities that we have where in the Gurmit, they have all shared. You will see the various websites where we have the sharing of the music, and it's very proudly portrayed and used. Then again, we had the sharing of how it is in the theatre form itself by Salacious Paper. So we have the memos, we have the fiction, we have the non-fiction, drama, poetry, folklore, or the folk tale itself. Now it comes to the end, but we also have quite a few questions which were shared while we had the presentations today. We have a question from Baitoram Ramharak, which reads as, there is a body of literature that argues that Indian identity became hybrid and transformational when the Gurmiators boarded the ships. To what extent is the Fiji Gurmit consciousness identity influenced historically by the threats from non-Gurmitya community, or currently by India's willingness to recognize the presence of Gurmitya abroad? So is there anyone who wishes to share their perspective on this question that Baitoram Ramharak has for us? What type of identity do Fiji Indians or the Fiji Gurmit consciousness believe in, whether it is threats or whether it is, what do you actually believe is happening? Anyone wants to share their views on that? Then we have quite a few comments as well on the various presentations. So yes, anyone willing to share their views on Baitoram's comment here? What type of influence the native Fijian population has on the Gurmitya culture and identity, not the Europeans' influence? Anyone? I believe that quite a lot of literature that has been written actually portrays the relationship that the Indians have with the Fijian community. And it would be a very simple thing like sharing of the kava, or the use of the various ingredients in the cooking, or the use of the language, which has become part of our everyday conversation as well. So I think those are just simple things that I can share, which shows the influence of the Fijian population, not the European influence. Is there anything else anyone wants to share on that? Kamla, Salesh?
I think you've covered quite a bit, Dr. Chan. The main things that I can think of and are practical in nature would be language being the obvious. We've kind of all know what we're talking about when we talk about Talanoa and let's have some Palusami. And I had a fascinating presentation yesterday where I was part of Dr. Mohit Prasad's presentation, and he spoke about, again, language that we have come across. Words like Budesa is something that we all know what we're talking about, because he was particularly talking about Ningona. Yeah, those are the things I can think of. I think another place where language we've kind of borrowed heavily is when you see two Indo-Fijians fighting. And if you listen to the swears, most of the swears are Itoke swears that we use. So language in general is mostly the obvious place. But also in food, in terms of lovo, we all know what, and we all kind of love to have lovo. But also, I would like to talk about my understanding of Itoke institutions. We've all been part of a Sevu Sevu, so we all understand what that is when we're welcomed. But interestingly, I would also like to talk about the acceptance recently, just a few years back, as Indo-Fijians being the children of Nozo. So maybe that is something that we need to keep in mind also. The fact that the Itoke of the country, and there's a particular clan who have actually accepted all Indo-Fijians as children of Fiji. So that I can also think would be something worthy of looking at. But I think it's mutual. They've also picked a lot from us also. I know of a friend, an Itoke woman who wakes up each morning at 5 to make roti and curry for her kids. So I think it's mutual. Thank you. I'll let the others add to that.
Thank you, Salesh. Definitely, those are very good examples of how we have actually had that mutual relationship. And there is, at an ordinary level, very little colonial influence in the way we behave when we have a conversation, or when we go to each or visit each other. There is very little of the colonial influence apart from maybe greeting, but everyone knows what form of greeting the other ethnic group actually uses, and it's very easily shared. Anyone else would like to share any other perspective or any other comments or anything else regarding the various presentations we have had? I think we had a wonderful session, a variety of presentations showing all sorts of perspective, as well as, I would say, interpretation. And it's very heartening to see the younger generation taking interest in writing and doing research, which is something I think this these types of conferences has actually given them the opportunity, which I think may not have been there had Gilmit conferences not been organized, because these are the avenues, and these avenues also give the opportunity to think about what are the various topics that you can research on. Definitely, that's something that actually comes out very much in this presentation. Anything else anyone wants to share, Kamla?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. There was a question for me by Satish Dutt, and he asked as to why the Hindi vernacular language was suppressed. Actually, when our ancestors came, they came with many languages. So to understand and to connect with each other, they started learning Hindi, which is Fiji Hindi, and that is what we are speaking these days. And then the ancestors wanted their children to learn English. Because they felt that if they speak the English, then they will come out of the slavery that the indentured laborers are in. And also with the English language, they'll be able to progress. That was one reason. And another one is that the colonialists, they wanted the indentured laborers to learn English. That is why they coined words like cane top, godam, which means go down, cane top, and many words like that were coined so that they can converse with the colonialists in their language. Was that culture? And our culture, that is the ancestors' culture, was looked down upon by the whites. And the other thing that I would like to tell Satish here is, Professor Subramani has written 2 books in Fiji Hindi, Doka Puran and Fiji Ma. I wonder how many of us are reading that. So he is trying to put the indentured laborers' concerns, their happiness, everything in those 2 books. But how many of us have read? So there, in which way is Hindi suppressed can be seen, but at the same time, English took the upper hand because of the colonialist language. And today we are able to put our thoughts on paper because of the English language. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Kamla. We are very honored to have amongst us Professor Brijlal, who would like to say something. So I'm just waiting for him to be given the opportunity to share his views. So let's see. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, can you see me?
No, you won't. They won't be able to see you.
No.
We will allow.
Those would like to going to be a panelist.
Ranjit, can you?
You're joining me as me at the moment anyway.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. All right. Start my video.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Professor. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Yes. The technical assistance has to be online. Okay. Here we go.
Right. But first of all, let me say thank you. Thank you for the various presentations. I was particularly impressed by the younger ones, early career researchers, who have taken time out to talk about things that are really important, about identity, about culture, about language, and so on. The many, many issues that have come up, which could take up a lot of time discussing. For example, the whole question of Hindi. Now, Hindi was made a lingua franca by the colonial government only in 1920, because when indenture ended, they had to communicate with the Indian settlers who had remained in Fiji, and there was a kind of a cultural elite which determined what kind of Hindi was acceptable and which was not acceptable. And of course, it's only after independence with FM 96 and so on that you have audiences participating in Fiji Hindi without feeling any sense of inferiority or shame. And now, of course, Fiji Hindi is very much a part of our cultural landscape. The other question that goes back to Baitaram's question is this whole question of intercultural borrowing. Now, it's important to realize that Fiji was very different from, say, the Caribbean countries. There was no free market for cultural ideas for exchange in Fiji as it was, say, in Guyana or Trinidad and elsewhere. We were, by law, segregated into different compartments, Europeans, Fijians, Indo-Fijians, and so on. Our memory was racially archived until very, very recently. Our electoral system and so on were all racially organized. So I think that this, that Sailesh talked about in a wonderful paper, this whole question of borrowing and assimilation is something that has happened in the last, let's say 20, 30 years. And now it's increasing in popularity as well, with the growth of a large middle class and with kids going to multiracial schools of the kind that were very rare in Fiji in the colonial period. But I don't want to hog the limelight. I just wanted to say I thoroughly enjoyed the presentations, and I sit here sometimes wondering, you know, when people talk about my books, did I write that? But thank you, and I look forward to other papers later on in the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for those words. Definitely, we always look forward to having a conversation with you and hearing. I think no sessions will have enough of hearing from you. So I think I would echo the feelings from everyone who is present here. It is a pleasure to always have you around. It is a pleasure always to hear you. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who wants to share any more things? As I had said, definitely a very wonderful set of presentations, as well as I had said earlier too, very good to see. It's so humbling to see the younger generations showing an interest in researching, in literature, in writing on their ancestors.
Can I come in?
It gives a lot of pleasure in seeing that. Thank you so much.
Can I come in?
Yes, Satya, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the authority to get my camera on.
Rohit, Ranjit, can you arrange for that, please?
Join the panelist.
Yes, they will organize that. So.
Can you see me? Start my video.
Yeah.
There. All right, very interesting, the topics, and I must thank all the panelists to bringing up so many varieties of, the talk into these language and culture in these Gurmit and Indian diaspora. I have been listening and participating since this morning, and I'm so much impressed with all these. Now, just in the concluding remark by Toram, as I know, actually, was concerned about, the integrating of culture and language, the Fijians and Indians in Fiji. In my own assessment, it is very important for the Indians to learn Fijian language. When we, I taught there for 23 years in both Fijians and Indian schools there. And the feeling for me then was never that I must learn Fijian language. When I'm here, out of country in New Zealand, I just thought I have just missed the great opportunity that I had teaching and being with my Itoke brothers there, families, mixing and mingling, that we missed out. So all those who are there, my advice is there, try to learn as much as the language which is important to us, the Itoke language. This is one of the ways that we can integrate and culturally and otherwise as well. The other point was raised by Dr. Naikar. I think I have put that question over there about our mother tongue, about Hindi language, why it's been suppressed. Very well answered, but I will add to over there that colonization, English, language was always tried to be put right on top there. They wanted English, parents wanted English. If you learn English, then you will be able to get jobs and get into right careers and all that. When I was in school, my teachers, were punishing us if we were speaking in Hindi. We had that डोरी जो गोली जो है वो गला में पहना दिया जाता था, या पेनी जो है वो पहना दिया जाता था as punishment. Speak in English. Even हम भी जब पढ़ाते थे, I did right in my beginning of years there. Always, encourage my kids to speak in English because that is what is going to carry you along. But now, when I am now advocating for my own language there, I know I just feel very guilty that I have done that and my teachers were doing that. So language plays and our culture plays very important role in our life. And that is our identity, is that what we, all the speakers, they have been talking about. That's so great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satyaji, for your comments. And definitely for a linguist, any language has equal importance. And if we don't retain, if we don't speak, if you don't respect, and if you don't use the language, that language will die. And we have seen so many languages dying around the universe itself. So the smaller the population, I think the more the need for the language to be actually retained and used and shared. And that may be the way that we actually continue. And Fijian, as well as Fiji Hindi community, the population isn't that big. For that reason, there is a need to actually provide avenues or understand and respect and learn the languages. So I think I totally understand where you're coming from, as well as respect the views that any language, for that matter, needs that same type of audience, as well as the type of avenue so that it can be retained in that sense. Is there anyone else who would like to share any more views? If not, I would like to close this session, a very wonderful session, which was looking at very important ideologies that we all who come from diasporic communities hold dear. The language that we have, the literature, and the creative art. And there is a continuation of this session later tonight from midnight, which will have papers from Trinidad, Australia, India, Mauritius, and South Africa. So it would again be very interesting, and see if you can share, if you are in Fiji, try to have a few coffees and join me again when we will hear interesting papers from Prem Nath Gupta, Vijay Mishra, and the likes of others who are going to share their views again on language, literature, and creative arts. Have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you later tonight. Thank you very much for your time and presenting wonderful, interesting papers today. Thank you.